On April 7, 1917, one day following the U.S. Congress's declaration of war on Germany and formal entry into World War I, an emergency meeting of the Socialist Party of America convenes in St. Louis, Missouri. By an overwhelming majority, the party denounces America's entry as a crime against the people, declares it a war, imperialistic on both sides, and pledges continuous, active, and public opposition to the war through demonstrations, mass petitions, and all other means within our power. We will not willingly give a single life or single dollar. Within 2 months, President Wilson signs into law the Espionage Act, enabling sentences up to 20 years for anyone willfully interfering with military operations or recruitment. Immediately, socialists throughout the country are indicted, convicted, and jailed. A third of socialist meeting halls are destroyed, and dissemination of the majority of socialist publications are banned from the mails. On June 15, 1917, in New York, Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman are arrested during a raid on their offices, charged with conspiracy to induce persons not to register, and sentenced to 2 years in prison. In July 1917, in North Dakota, Kate Richards O'Hare is sentenced to 5 years in prison for making an anti-war speech. On September 5, 1917, a national dragnet rounds up 166 senior members of the IWW, raiding the headquarters of the Socialist Party and of the IWW and 20 branch offices of the IWW in different states. Among them are many of Hellen's close friends and allies, provoking her to send an impassioned appeal directly to President Wilson. Hellen puts the president on notice. She makes the argument squarely. She lays her cards fully on the table, valiantly divulging more to the president. When Vladimir Lenin and the Bolshevik revolutionary forces seized power in Russia in the fall of 1917 in a nearly bloodless coup d'etat, the enthusiasm it generates among progressive circles worldwide is electric. For Hellen Keller, as for many, the establishment of the world's first constitutionally socialist state offers, from afar, the promise that the dream of a more egalitarian and just restructuring of the world could in fact be made a reality. By the late 1930s, with the arrival of reports on the wave of political purges, mass executions and incarcerations in the Soviet Union, Hellen's support of the Russian experiment becomes tempered, albeit somewhat. Belatedly, she would in time turn against Stalin, though her conviction in the promise of the Soviet dream endured, gaining new traction when the Russian army combats Nazi Germany during World War II. Following a forthright dinner discussion with a staunch critic of the Soviet Union in 1943, Hellen decides to follow up with a letter hoping to clarify any misunderstanding. As Hellen confided to a friend about the exchange days later, "Alas, I am incorrigible, but what can one do when one believes that the truth is the highest compliment human beings can pay each other?"
So the question is about the Soviet Union, and particularly about Lenin. So what was Leninism? Well, here we have to look at the facts. Now, you look at the facts, I think here's what you find. Lenin was a right-wing deviation of the socialist movement, and he was so regarded. He was regarded as that by the Marxists, by the mainstream Marxists. We've forgotten who the mainstream Marxists were because they lost, and you only remember the guys who won. But if you go back to that period, the mainstream Marxists were people like, for example, Anton Pannekoek, who was head of education for the Marxist movement. And he's one of the people who Lenin later denounced as an infantile leftist. But he was one of the leading intellectuals of the actual Marxist movement. Rosa Luxemburg was another mainstream Marxist, and there were others. And they were very critical. In fact, Trotsky was one up until 1917. They were all very critical of Leninism because of this, what they regarded as this opportunistic vanguardism. The idea that the radical intelligentsia were going to exploit popular movements to seize state power and then to use that state power to whip the population into the society that they chose. After all, the core of socialism was understood to be workers' control over production. That was the core. That's where you begin with. Then you go on to other things. But the beginning is control by the workers over production. That's where it begins. Then Lenin took power. in October 1917 in what's called a revolution, but in my view ought to be called a coup. And things followed that coup, or revolution, if you want to call it that. One of the things that followed it was the immediate moves to destroy the Soviets and the factory councils. Those were some of the first moves of Lenin and Trotsky after they took, Trotsky joined at that point, after they took state power. In fact, if you look at what Lenin wrote after that period, or did, you'll find it's a reversion to the earlier position. This sort of left deviation is that, a deviation. You could ask why. In my view, it was just opportunistic. He knew that in order to gain power, he was going to have to go along with the popular currents that were developing, which were in fact spontaneous and libertarian and socialist, as most popular movements have been, in fact, since the 17th century. And being an astute politician, which he was, he sort of went along with that and talked the line that the people wanted to hear. It's just like when an American politician goes somewhere and his pollsters tell him, say so-and-so, and he says it, doesn't mean he believes it. And I think Lenin was doing the same thing without polls. Well, after that comes the view that all of this is socialism. And why should the communist parties take that view? I think the reason is because they wanted to sort of exploit the moral force of socialism, which was quite real. You know, it's kind of hard to remember that today, but at that time it was very real. This was regarded as a, you know, as a progressive moral force, and by associating their own destruction of socialism with the aura of socialism, they hoped to gain credit in the working classes and other progressive sectors. Now, the West also identified that with socialism, and they did it for the opposite reason. They wanted to associate socialism with the brutality of the Russian state that undermined socialism. So what you had is that the two major world propaganda agencies, for their own and quite different reasons, were claiming that this is socialism, that this destruction of socialism is socialism. And it's very hard to break out of the control of the world's two major propaganda agencies when they agree. They agreed for different reasons, but they basically agreed, and that's then became doctrine and dogma.